In today's discussion, we are going to trace the history of the formation of Muslim League. We all know that during the last decade of the 19th century, the Muslim elites, particularly in northern India, had been activated by an acute community consciousness. But at the time when Muslim League was formed in 1906-1907, some nationalists looked upon this as a sort of a command performance by the Muslim leaders at the prodding of Lord Minto. Now, whether it was a command performance or the foundation of the Muslim League can be explained in terms of the larger processes remains an important question for us to address.
Sir, what is this command performance?
This idea of the command performance is that before the Muslim League was formed, and this was formed when the Muslim Educational Conference actually met at Dhaka in December 1906. In October 1906, exactly on the 1st October, a group of Muslim leaders, all of them from northern India, there was no representation from Bengal, met Minto, led by Aga Khan, and tried to convince him about the need for safeguards for the Muslims in the promised elected body. The kind of electoral reform that the projected reforms actually suggested alarmed them, and they went to Minto asking for safeguard. So it is suggested that Minto had asked them to set up an organization, and they decided to form the Muslim League in this context. Now, whether it was a consequence of a command performance or there was an already developing initiative from within the Muslim elite to form a Muslim organization, what is important is that the formation of Muslim League in 1906 came at the height of the Swadeshi movement. So one may presume that at the time when the Swadeshi movement needed a greater amount of support from within Indian society, including the support of the Muslims, the decision to form Muslim League in order to press home certain advantages with regard to the reformed legislature that Morley and Minto had proposed had certainly introduced a very powerful dissenting element within the nationalist movement. One might presume that command performance was perhaps not the only way to look at such initiatives, because one has to locate this particular event in the larger context of an ongoing process among the Muslim elites about how to protect their identity in a land dominated by the Hindu educated classes. You know that throughout the 1890s, there were some very important issues that had driven wedges in the relationship between the two communities. You have the cow protection movement, which was looked upon by the Muslims as a threat to their cultural identity. The language controversy, which was generated by the campaign in favor of Hindi, also reached a high point during the 1890s when, towards the close of the decade, the United Provinces government had issued the circular known as the Nagri Circular. The Nagri Circular, which actually allowed the use of Nagri as an official script. So the Urdu-Nagri controversy or the cow protection movement and the resultant animosities, often leading to riots in some of the urban areas, all this can be seen as the context in which the politics of identity became very crucial. And the politics of identity was responsible to a large extent for initiatives by the Muslim elites to form their own organizations.
Sir, how did this identity politics among the Muslim elites shape their decision to form a separate organization?
That is exactly what I was trying to suggest, that if you actually remember the broader context in which the Muslims became acutely conscious about how to protect their identity, you can see the evocations, the articulations of the politics of identity. Particularly in northern India, where the Muslims had constituted the governing classes. Now, if the Congress scheme for a competitive examination was adopted, if electoral reforms had accepted the principle of election, which basically implies competition among candidates for positions in the legislatures rather than entirely depending on the nominations by the government, by the British rulers, then you are actually in a situation where the majority community, now organized around many of these issues like the language question or the cow protection issue, the implications of which were seen in the North Indian municipal elections during the early 1890s, all these would actually constitute a threat. So it is not an accident that after Syed Ahmed Khan had tried with that provincial body called the United India Patriotic Association in 1888, in the early part of the 1890s, in association with Theodore Beg, the principal of Aligarh College, Syed Ahmed Khan decided to form the Anglo-Indian Mohammedan Oriental Defence Association. So obviously the name itself actually suggests how there was an acute awareness about the need to defend the cultural identity of the Muslims. Particularly, this crisis was germane in the minds of the Muslim elites. Come down to the end of the decade, and by that time Syed Ahmed Khan had passed away in 1898 before the Nagri circular was issued. But once they could actually see how the Hindi movement was making an impact and there was a possibility of the government actually playing with the wind or going with the tide, the Urdu Defence Association was formed in 1898-99 in order to defend Urdu. So it is in these areas you see the politics of identity at work. And if you see the foundation of Muslim League as the more tangible expression of such initiatives that had started already in the 1890s, you don't see the formation of Muslim League merely as a command performance, however much you have evidence to argue that the Muslim leaders had actually established communications with the Viceroy and had been prodded by the Viceroy to set up their own organization. Even if the Viceroy had done so, an organization in a different form, under the initiative of a different set of people, perhaps would have taken place, would have been formed because of this prehistory, because of the kind of turmoil in the minds of the Muslim elites that you come across in the course of the 1890s. So that is where the politics of identity remains relevant. So if we are to explain the historical process through which the Muslim League ultimately emerged in 1906, strengthening the separatist tendencies in their espousal for separate electorate during the promised reforms of 1909, you have to consider the kind of conglomeration of events that was unfolding at the turn of the century. Among the Muslim elites of North India, you see an important division taking place in the early part of the 20th century. Some followers of Syed Ahmed Khan, younger in age, who came to be known as the Young Party, decided to discard the loyalist political line that Syed Ahmed Khan had adopted. You are all familiar with Syed Ahmed Khan's loyalism. He felt that by practicing loyalism to the British, it would be easier for the Muslim elites to extract advantages from the rulers. They were successful to some extent. But the behavior of the United Provinces government towards the close of the decade, when they passed the Nagri resolution, convinced some younger members of the political elites among the Muslim community that this loyalist strategy was not going to pay any more dividends. It was important for them to create an outfit that would be in a position to exert greater pressure on the government in the same way that the Congress had done. Congress was doing.
Yes. Who were this young party?
Basically, a younger generation of politicians, people like, say, Shaukat Ali or Muhammad Ali, those who were associated with the Aligarh movement, but later on became prominent nationalist leaders who had allegiance both to the Congress and to the Muslim League during Khilafat non-cooperation agitation, became closely associated with Gandhi later on. But at that stage, under the inspiration of a man called Abdul Bari, who was not actually very favorably disposed towards British rule, Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali were contemplating a more assertive political action by the Muslim elites. There are others too. You will come across men with similar views in the Punjab. So there was an inclination on the part of such men to work out a more assertive strategy in order to get a better deal from the government. And I have just mentioned that the Urdu-Nagri controversy, and convinced them that unless the Muslim elites were able to put adequate pressure on the government, the loyalist strategy was likely to give them nothing. That was one important part of the political process that we are discussing. The other thing comes from Bengal. People who are not at all represented in the deputation to Minto, when the Muslim deputationists met at Simla, October 1906. They were from Bengal, people like the Nawab of Dhaka, Salimullah. By 1905-1906, as you know, the Swadeshi movement had reached a high crescendo. And predictably, the government adopted repressive measures. The government of the newly created province of Eastern Bengal and Assam, Bamfil Fuller was the lieutenant governor, was particularly oppressive. But despite all these repressive measures, it became difficult for the government to contain the gradual ascendancy of the Swadeshi Samitis in the Eastern Bengal districts. The repressive measures, on the contrary, had created an extremely adverse reaction in the British press, for which reason the Liberal Secretary of State and John Morley, the great liberal scholar, was very indignant about the manner in which Bamfil Fuller's regime was accused of unleashing extreme repressive measures. So there was a feeling gaining ground in Eastern Bengal that there was a likelihood of Bamfil Fuller resigning his lieutenant governorship under the pressures from his superiors. Bamfil Fuller was particularly pro-Muslim as well. I mean, he had an interest in propping up this newly created province as a Muslim province. You know that before that partisan decision was actually implemented, Curzon had gone around Eastern Bengal trying to convince the Muslim intelligentsia and the elites the bright prospects that this newly created province actually promised them. And Muslim intelligentsia had been sufficiently enticed by Curzon's overtures. So Fuller actually kept on harping on this tune by suggesting that the new province was going to be a heaven for the Muslim elites. So the kind of interest that the Muslim elites had developed in the newly created province also was the reason why the idea that Fuller might resign was a source of great consternation among people like the Nawab of Dhaka. So there was an initiative on their part as well to defend the partition at a time when the Congress was up in arms against the partisan decision and had gone to the extent of adopting boycott resolution. The intensity of the Swadeshi movement, the Congress's acceptance of the boycott resolution, and then the possibility of Fuller resigning his lieutenant governorship were enough reasons for the Muslim elites of Eastern Bengal to feel somewhat nervous about the future. So, in an attempt to defend the partition, in an attempt to defend the interest that they had already developed in this newly created province, there was an urgency on their part as well to form a separate organization of the Muslims. So, on the one hand, you have this young party of Aligarh who are keen to follow a more assertive strategy, and the implications of this change would become very clear during the next decade, particularly after the war, when the Khilafat agitation would be able to draw in many such men. So there was a change of mood, there was a change of temper. On the other hand, you have the men like Salimullah, the Nawab of Dhaka, who were keen to protect the interest that the government had created among the Muslim elites in this new province. So these two things converged, and you may look upon these as the political processes that eventually led to the formation of the Muslim League in 1906. Why was it that suddenly there was an activation? We understand the case of Eastern Bengal and Assam. The province was created and it had developed as a kind of an interest for the Muslim leadership who had a certain reason to defend it. But in addition to that, there was an announcement by Morley, the famous budget speech of Morley, in which Morley had suggested that representative government was the ultimate objective that the British were actually looking for. Morley had his reasons. We have just mentioned that Morley was a liberal. He had his own ideological professions, but at the same time he had his friends among Indian congressmen. Gokhale was in London before the Calcutta session was held in 1906, and apparently Gokhale had a series of meetings with Morley in which he actually tried to convince Morley about the need for the British to announce the possibility of colonial self-government, that India should remain within the empire, but India should be accorded dominion status.
Sir, to what extent was Morley's liberalism successful in determining British policies in India?
In a sense, it didn't make much of an impact. And that has been the case throughout the history of the relationship between British liberalism and the Indian policy. You had seen in Ripon's case the same predicament. Ripon wanted to implement certain reforms which could not be implemented because of the resistance from within the bureaucracy. Morley also had his good intentions perhaps, but Morley never actually endorsed Gokhale's demand that India deserved colonial self-government. But Morley was willing to introduce elements of electoral representation in the legislative councils, both at the imperial level and at the provincial level. He was willing to associate Indians in the day-to-day governance of the country by opening the gates of the Executive Council for a larger number of non-official Indian members. He was willing to reduce the control that the officials usually exercised over these legislative bodies. Even if people were nominated from non-official circles, from influential classes, basically these were nominated members. There was no provision for directly elected members of the legislature who would be in a better position to deliberate on government policy or to represent before the government their demands or the demands of the Indian people. So that is something Morley was willing to concede, not colonial self-government. So one may actually find fault with the application of liberalism in the Indian context. But if we consider the utter conservatism of the rank and file of the British bureaucracy, then such examples of liberalism at least introduce an element of dissent, a dissenting voice at least, into the broader corpus of imperial ideology. Minto, on the other hand, was not even willing to give these concessions. Minto, who succeeded Curzon, wished to retain the bureaucratic control over all these legislatures. When this particular announcement was made by Morley, there was predictable unease among the Muslim elites who felt that just in the same way the municipalities had come to be dominated almost entirely by the elected majority, the same story would be repeated in the legislatures as well. So they made it a point to form a group and to see Minto in Simla, which is known as the famous Simla deputation, in which they actually asked for safeguards for the Muslims, the minority, which may not actually be able to compete on equal terms with the Hindu elites, but who deserve to be treated differently for their history of being a part of the erstwhile ruling class, their importance in the local society, at least in certain regions of India, their importance in the landed society. So their idea was to press for the kind of principle of representation which would not be based on the principle of territorial representation. You do not represent one territory, you represent interests. So you may have the landholders constituency where the landholders would be represented by landholders. You have the professional people's constituency. You have the Muslim constituency. So the idea for them was to slice up the constituencies, the electoral constituencies, into distinct interest groups, into segments which would be representing distinct interest groups, including landlords, professionals, or business interests. The Muslims would figure among such interest groups who deserve to be represented in their own right in the legislatures. So that is the idea that the deputationists actually tried to uphold. And Minto responded favorably by asking them to form a separate organization for the Muslims. So that is the story surrounding the so-called Simla deputation of October 1906. But the end result of this was the decision by the Muslim elites from northern India meeting in Dhaka in the annual session of the Muslim Educational Conference to launch the All India Muslim League. And it synchronized with the ongoing deliberations on the council reform, which eventually was enacted in the famous Morley-Minto reforms, actually known as the India Councils Act of 1909. But between 1905 and 1906 down to 1909, there was an ongoing discussion about what should be the nature of this reform. And whenever Morley came up with his own ideas, Morley didn't wish to alienate the moderates. There was a need on the part of the British liberals like Morley to salvage the moderates from the predicament they had found themselves in view of the rising tide of Swadeshi, where the moderates had become discredited. Gokhale had become discredited because of his failure to extract that tangible concession called colonial self-government. So there was so much of criticism within the Congress that Morley felt that some amount of concessions needed to be given to the moderates so that the moderate position was to some extent vindicated. So Morley wished the system to become more representative, wished the principle of election to be grafted into the manner in which the legislative councils, both at the center and the provinces, would be constituted. But all through this period, you have pressure groups operating on behalf of the Muslim League in London, exercising a contrary influence. Syed Amir Ali had created a kind of a London branch of All India Muslim League and tried to convince the British authorities there in London that separate electorate was the only protective cover that the Muslim League or the Muslims as a community could hope for. So by one stroke, the separate electorate turned a religious group into a political interest, imposed an element of homogeneity on a community which was otherwise fragmented along class lines, along linguistic lines, along regional lines. There was no element of commonness between a Muslim peasant in eastern Bengal or in Malabar and the Urdu-speaking Sharifs of northern India. But by one stroke, the government was succeeded in imposing a certain kind of homogeneity on the Muslim community in the political sense, even though one might argue that this particular measure that was adopted in 1909, because of the very restricted franchise of that time, did not allow the inclusion of the large number of Muslim peasants of the countryside to become a part of the electorate. It remained in any case a very limited electorate, but in the long run, the manner in which this kind of a homogeneous political interest was invented by the British through this maneuvering, the implications were realized later when, on the basis of these early experiences, the Muslim League came up with the demand for a separate state. Of course, it came later. In between, you have a very tortuous history, and one might not be actually right in arguing that the separate electorate of 1909 actually allows you to draw a straight line from 1909 to 1940. In Lahore, where the demand for Pakistan was raised, the Pakistan resolution was adopted. One cannot actually imagine a straight line between the two events. You have many slipshots, many slippages coming in between that eventually made the separate electorate the basis on which the demand for a separate state was raised. But then one might also look upon the separate electorate of 1909 as a very important turning point. So you come to the next decade, the decade that begins with the transfer of capital to Delhi from Calcutta, the decision to annul the partition of Bengal, while at the same time the decision to separate Bihar and Orissa from Bengal presidency to create a separate province. That was the decade when we come across tendencies of Muslim League and the Congress coming together. And this was also the time when you have the second more powerful bout of revolutionary terrorism, but that is a different story. So if we are to wind up this discussion, we can start with the question that we had raised in the very early part of the discussion, that it was not really a command performance. They had their interests to protect and defend. There was a political process going on among the Muslim elites from the 1890s onwards. That should be taken as the basic reasons for the Muslims to decide on the formation of a distinct political organization capable of defending their interests.